Welcome everyone to the IAPP web conference, Generative AI, Privacy and Ethical Considerations for Your Business, sponsored today by Catch. My name is Marjorie Boyer, and I am a speaker and programming coordinator here at the IAPP. I'll be your host for today's program. We'll be getting started with the presentation in just a minute, but before we do, a few program details. Participating in today's web conference will automatically provide IAPP certified privacy professionals who are the named registrants with 1 CPE credit. A copy of today's web conference will be available in your My IAPP, My Purchases, My Recordings portal within 48 hours. Please feel free to post any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A area at the bottom of the screen. Now on to our program, and I'd like to introduce today's panelists. Alyssa Hutnick, Partner and Chair of Privacy and Security at Kelly Dry, Jonathan Joseph, Chief Solutions and Marketing Officer at Catch, and Yakov Solomon, Lecturer in Machine Learning and AI at Berkeley. It's a pleasure to have the three of you here, and we are looking forward to this conversation. So with that, I will hand it over to our panelists.
Hey, Marjorie, thanks. Lisa and Yakov, thanks for joining us. You both appropriately have libraries in the background there.
Yes.
I love the collaboration we got here. So we've got legal expertise with Elisa at Kelly Dry, and we've got technology expertise with Yakov. And so we'll have a free-flowing discussion today on generative AI. Yakov, I wanted to start with you. You're a lecturer at UC Berkeley on machine learning and AI, and I know you wear a number of hats and have been in kind of the machine learning game and AI game for at least 20 years. Maybe this is the time to tell everybody you're not real, you're just AI generated yourself. Maybe we can save that for later. But I wanted to our flow for today, is let's talk about where we are in the AI journey. And what does generative AI actually mean? What's the primer on that? And then we'll roll into, Elisa, like what are the legal considerations? How do we think about this in a very practical way, which you're amazing at? And then Yakov, you've written a couple pieces on AI and how it pertains to privacy. So we'll discuss those and get your perspective, but also some of how privacy tech is evolving and innovating to kind of capture AI. And then lastly, some of the work you're doing at the Ethical Tech Project as we think about principles to govern AI and an ethical internet, and some of the technical pieces to that. So if we stay on track, get all those four things done, it'll be great, and we'll save some time for questions as well. So firstly, Yakov, the AI journey, like where are we in that? I know we've had a couple of AI winters, if you will, and this one feels a little different with generative AI. Like, where are we in that journey? What does generative AI mean to you?
Yeah, we're definitely in the summer right now.
Right.
It doesn't look like winter is coming. But yeah, so I mean, just to frame a little bit generative AI. So first of all, generative AI is a subset of AI. It's the algorithms that we use for generating content. The main two types of content we generate are typically images and text. Generative AI has evolved, I'd like to say, over the last 5-7 years. There are two classes of generative AIs. There's what we call GANs, generative adversarial network. They were very in fashion about 5 years ago. The classic or the more popular example was, how do you fake a Picasso? So those systems were built to kind of two systems fighting each other or learning from each other on how to get better and better at doing tasks, and they were very good at sparse data sets. And the second one is GPT, General Pre-trained Transformers, which is the current technology that is making all the splash. The Team GPT, the Transformers, is the newest technology that we have been perfecting for some time. And Transformers are really good at doing three things. The first thing they've done much better than previous generations is in parallelizing how we process the data. So think of it in very simplistic, like if before we were doing one word at a time, now we can do whole sentences. So that improved in paragraphs. So that improved a lot the text. The second thing that we've cracked the code on there is what we call the attention units. Part of the problem that we always had with language specifically is that understanding what this word means in the context sometimes relates to words in the past and maybe not the immediate ones. And if you open up the problem, that creates a lot of what we call combinatorics problems, so a lot of permutations there, and attentions were a way to solve all of that. So they got really good at understanding context of words within big bodies of text. And the third thing we got really good at with transformers, where we brought to the forefront, is this idea of encoders, decoders. We've used that for translations of languages and many other machine learning algorithms in the past. And what the current encoder decoder technology allows is to train these things on unsupervised, large corpuses of data, right? So that's basically what the GPT-3 to 4 to 5 and so on is going to do, is increase the ability to train on larger and larger data sets. So all of that came together, and I think it's fair to say that nobody was ready for it to caught on fire as it did right now. Even OpenAI famously, when they they were working already on GPT-4 and 5, and they released GPT-3. They didn't expect this to have the reaction that it did, beyond being just a curious thing. So it is a moment in time, and sometimes you can't predict these things. But in some ways, we were heading here for some time now, and it is an evolution rather than a revolution in terms of the models and algorithms.
Yeah, Yaakov, it's like there's a question around why now, and I mean the way my simple brain thinks about it is you had computing power and you need data. And this perfect consumer-focused use case in ChatGPT, where you could just ask it questions, seems to be the perfect opportunity to throw data at the computing power, right? And so I wanted to ask you, and Elisa, when we talked about this in the prep, you kind of gave us the term democratized AI, right? It does kind of feel like that, not to introduce a new term right now, but Yaakov, where does Gen AI help? Like, what kind of use cases are you seeing? When we talked about this earlier, you talk about how it helps in 3 areas. It creates, it distills, it integrates. Can you unpack those 3 for us and kind of talk through the use cases where you're seeing Gen AI being used mostly?
Yeah, so I think as a technology, these are really the 3 things: the create, distill, and integrate, where I think a lot of the application or the use cases for what Gen AI will do will come. So create is, especially in the language area, but also in images, what is this idea that we have now an interface into a lot of places where we before had to have some special language. So, I mean, coding is a great example, right? So if before you wanted to write services and run, servers and everything else, you had to know domain-specific languages, DSLs, that are specific for every one of those tasks, things like, programming languages. Well, now with things like Gen AI, we can create a natural language interface into those. So if you're a coder, you can describe what you want to achieve in English, and that will produce code. If you're a designer, you can describe in words the sort of images or whatever you want to manipulate an image. Adobe just came out with a great demo. Then it creates that. So we created another interface that in many ways, quote unquote, democratizes some of these domains so that they're open up for more folks. So I think the create side is very powerful, and I think there's a lot of applications are going to come from that. So we said create. Distill is this idea that we had search. We created the internet, which was great. We've put all of our knowledge online, which is phenomenal. So now everybody can access all that information from everywhere. That's remarkable. Then we had a problem of how do you find information in it? So we created search. But now what I think Gen AI takes it one level further, it's this idea of summarizing, distilling. So you can cover a lot of ground very fast by getting it to distill a large body of knowledge, right, into some key points. And I think that's very powerful as well. There's of course problems that come up, and I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about what does it mean for it if it doesn't get it right, and misinformation, etc. But that's another big power that Gen AI has. And the third one is this idea of integration, of creating links between body of knowledge or domains that we had before. So a great example is even simple use cases, right? Like you could connect it into OpenTable and Yelp and some other reviews, etc., and some data source for a whole lot of meals, and you can start seeing how you can, connect experiences now across these things that before were very isolated, and now it's really easy to create something that feeds from all of these different data sources. So integrating these isolated domains, I think, will be another big area where Gen AI is going to make a big splash.
Elisa, from your perch, what are you seeing in terms of the use cases or the thing your clients are asking most about when it comes to generative AI?
So, I mean, I think the democratization is an important thing, because in some ways, like, AI was used by obviously a number of companies, but the natural language ability and democratization in the sense of making it so much more available, in some ways, conceptually, like, the sky is the limit. And so I think for a lot of in-house counsel who the business is coming to, we have these new ideas. This is this new shiny object tool. We want to use it. And I think it's being presented in all types of scenarios. The customer service obviously is a big one. Marketing, wherever we're a capitalist society. So wherever we can create efficiency, differentiation, where are some pain points? Obviously, we will talk about it today, but we've got privacy trends, which are making access and how we use personal data subject to a lot more restrictions. So where might a tool like this be helpful in that scenario? So I think ultimately it's the sky's the limit. And I know there was a comment, and I'll just note that we'll address how do you revoke, right? There may be inaccurate information, and we will get into that as we go into the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, there was a question about, Jakob, I don't know if you want to address it now or later, but ChatGPT learns from public data from the internet. How do you revoke data in that context?
Well, I think there is the technical how, which we can discuss how models should going forward. And I don't think that I mean, I'll say it up front, I don't think we're doing a good job of any of it right now, but we got to figure out how governance of data becomes part of how these models are being trained, and digital rights and a whole lot of stuff. So I do see a long, many cases and litigation and a whole lot of stuff happening around this space before we figure out exactly how we do it. But the short answer is, I mean, the assumption we had so far that publicly available data is publicly available, we need to question that maybe a little bit and understand a little bit, how do we create more, some form of trusted spheres of where the data is and how do we relate to it. I think we have that problem elsewhere. I mean, outside of AI as well, the internet is still doesn't reflect in many, many ways concepts that we had built in offline world about trust and fiduciary relationships and circles of trust. I mean, internet was by design very open, and that was some of the great power there. But I think now that everybody is there, now that that's the town square, now we need to introduce this idea of how do we create those spheres of trust around data. So yeah, I don't think we're there yet.
Gotcha. Thanks, Jakob. So final question on this one. You talk about generative AI, and one of the concepts that comes along with it is this idea of synthetic data. Can you unpack that for us a little bit? Kind of what is synthetic data? I read a quote this morning that Elisa sent around on that Gartner said synthetic data will outnumber real data by 2030. And so what is it, and how is it useful in generative AI?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, just the basic, when we build a model, one of the things we need to do is train it. And the training aspect of model requires data. And once you train the model and it's out there, it's doing what we call inference. It doesn't consume data, it just takes in an input and produces an output. But that transfer is just there. So it's the training step that is really requiring data for teaching the model. And then the question, where would the data come from? The most ideal situation is if it's real data, because then it captures the most information about the system you're trying to model. But there are scenarios where that is a problem, right? First, maybe you don't have enough data. Maybe, for whatever reasons. Maybe you don't have access to the data. That's another thing. But there's also other aspects, right? Like maybe the data is It has issues around privacy and confidentiality and security and other concepts like that. So in all of these cases, the ability to create synthetic data becomes very powerful. That's one solution. I mentioned before, just to make a point, the GANs, the generative adversarial networks, they were another way in which you can learn, but instead of providing synthetic data, they just make the model much better at learning with much less data. And I want to make that point now, because also with generative AI, the big companies, OpenAI, Google, etc., their rush right now is to create bigger and bigger algorithms that use more and more data in some ways. There is a parallel effort right now in the open source community around generative AI, which is to create models that can be trained on less and less data, actually produce the same or very close results for a fraction of the cost. So there's efforts, and that's actually fascinating. The speed at which the open source community stepped up on generative AI over the last 3 months is just mind-boggling. But those aside, in all cases where you still need data, you might go to synthetic data. Synthetic data still uses some real data to model around. So there is some seed of data there that it's based on. But if you want to have an algorithm that detects, that this field is a social security number, and this is a first name, and this is an address, of course, you could feed it real data, but that might be problematic. So you need some way to generate synthetic data. Synthetic data, the other key problem with it is that it will accentuate any biases that were in the data you fed in it. So it's that is really a feedback there. So the danger with synthetic data is that you need to watch out for those biases, but maybe you can also correct them. So we'll see. I believe that statement about synthetic data. I think it will be a very important tool.
Jakob, I want to push you a little bit on that last one, because one of the things, you have the data you have. Let's just say it's, your first party set, and bias is an issue you have with the data that you already do have. And so some of the research and use cases that I was exploring were, how do you use synthetic data to actually address the bias in the data that you have, right? That your population may not reflect population that you want to get the outputs more based on inputs that are actually just more representative. And so that in some ways that can be a helpful tool.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, if the biases are known, if the bias is as a result of having more of one type and less of the other, or something that you can already explore inside the data set, I can plot a graph of it and see, okay, I have too much of this and not enough of that, right? Synthetic data, I'll generate more of this rather than that. That's easy. The places where synthetic data will fail is if in your seed, in the data set you started with or you modeled around, you didn't have enough variation to begin with. It can't create new variations, right? Like, you can't create something from nothing. So it's kind of permutations or known things. You can organize them a little bit better, but the new, the tail of a distribution, let's say, that is not simple as you create a synthetic. So unless you don't, now, of course, if you know the underlying process that generated the data, then you can go there directly. So if we have good understanding of the system and the conditions, then we can generate synthetic data all day long, and it will be quite good representative.
So we have a lot of questions in the chat on synthetic data, and I know, JJ, we're going to move on, but I do want to maybe just give one practical example question to Jakob that we might talk about. There's a lot of challenges with privacy and sensitive personal information, health information, for example. And so thinking about both what is synthetic data, how might it be used, right? So that the business use case of the very sensitive health information that is linked to very particular individuals, even in a pseudonymous state, where synthetic data might help kind of fill in that gap. And it seems like you still have to process, you still have the sensitive personal information, but maybe you can add another hop in to create a lookalike audience that's essentially synthetic data that then trains the model or is then used in the use case. Jakob, can you maybe talk a little bit about the possibilities on that as you might see it in the future?
I think absolutely. I mean, we do it today already. So I think the combination, the tools that we have in our disposal that I think will work together. So again, at inference time, when I actually make predictions, I want the real data and I'm going to make real predictions on that, because that's when the rubber meets the road. For the training purposes, we will use a combination of synthetic data, so modeled, at least 1 degree removed from the original real data. We will clean it or unbiased it and work on it to correct things that we know already are missing in it. And we will build models that are good at extrapolating from synthetic data into the real world. And we do that by, again, using a little bit of real data to kind of motivate and check ourselves if we're still on the right track. But then other than that, let ourselves run with synthetic data. So yeah, that's the pattern that's going to repeat itself for sure.
Thanks, Jakob. And at least as you mentioned, like 20 minutes in, we're on slide 1. So let's start. Obviously, Jakob, thanks, and Elisa, thanks. So we're obviously in the formative stages, right, of the technology here and the use cases, but there's some very near-term legal implications, things we need to do today. And Elisa, can you guide us through some of the legal considerations here with AI and generative AI?
Sure. I mean, so at the end of the day, it's a risk assessment, and we're balancing, right? We have innovation, we have a lot of exciting use cases or helpful use cases. And so the question is really, what are those use cases? Based on those use cases, what are the risks that you can foresee, right? What's anticipated? And then how do you manage for those risks? And part of, the facts that we were talking about, the scenarios, it really does mean understanding the technology and what's happening so that you can be issue spotting appropriately. And I think on the next slide, we go into some more details, but having these kinds of conversations with non-lawyers is just really important. We're hearing from tons of clients because they're hearing from tons of their business clients on all different scenarios. And I think kind of with distilling without getting too complicated, you're looking at what are the consequences. That's as lawyers, whether you're a privacy lawyer or another kind of lawyer, you're trying to manage for risk. And so thinking about, it's hard in the sense of the abstract. Yes, we want to use generative AI, for example. Well, using it in the abstract, it's not all that helpful of a risk assessment as opposed to using it in what instance and thinking about what are the potential real world consequences as a result of that. And there's different types of laws that are going to come up. If you're dealing with people, then you're thinking consumer protection laws. And we've heard a lot from the Federal Trade Commission, Bedoya at the summit in spring. Certainly things that we can anticipate, right? What you say, you're responsible for what you say. That's just common deception 101. I think we're going to see a lot more of unfairness authority, which is what we've seen the FTC already do quite a bit more of than they have in the past. And that's thinking about consequences that injure consumers that they can't reasonably avoid. And there's not essentially a balance of kind of what are the benefits of that to competition, to our economy, and to consumers overall. So in order to do that risk assessment, right, that you can't say, I didn't know what the tool did. It's a black box, it's an algorithm. But in order to actually understand it, really does mean pushing both either the business or the third party to get some transparency there to be able to assess. Lots of other kinds of legal liabilities. We put a few in here, but these are the kinds of things to think about. And again, they're going to vary depending on the use case. If you hurt people, you've got tort and product liability. Depending on the application, how you are using it, it could be discriminatory and it could be in ways that trigger laws, right? Housing, insurance, eligibility for employment. And then there's not those, but other ways that might be discriminatory that can roll back up into an unfairness type claim. So I think it's thinking through the inputs and the outputs. This is content. And as Jakob said, there's a collection and distillation of original content to get the bottom line, the result of the query. Well, somebody created that original content. And so you've got the IP risks. We're seeing that now with the Hollywood writers' strike. concerns about their original content and not having that being taken over by chatbots. So I think there's a really important, we've talked about this a lot in the prep, of distinguishing between what are foreseeable consequences today with the use cases that we're talking about today versus, I think we're all kind of as a society, what are the supersized existential risks that really come to mind in thinking about a future iteration of what this might be, where we're, instead of generative AI, we're into sentient AI.
And Lisa, it's I love Bedoya's quote when he was at his keynote at the IAPP conference. These are the dusty old laws he references, right? Like, don't wait around for AI regulation. These dusty old laws around discrimination and whatnot. Give the FTC ability to regulate today. I wanted to ask you, how strong of a pillar is the unfairness pillar in unfair and deceptive? I know they've been chasing down the deceptive route. Is this now an opportunity for the FTC to chase down the unfairness route?
You know, they over the years they've taken the concept and they have obviously applied it in new circumstances, and some would say some of those circumstances are pretty aggressive. I think consumer protection, maybe just more broadly, it's always adapted to new technology. That is not new. I think what comes as a surprise to many businesses is, unlike a law that says in a very prescriptive way, if you are going to release this, you must do A through Z type components, and that's black letter. And consumer protection law, in large part, doesn't do that. It's really anticipating what are the foreseeable harms and what are things that we can do to address those harms. So one of the questions early on was, how do you revoke, undo if there's false information about a person, right? You did a query and it says that you are something you are not. And so thinking about where the company providing the tool is giving consumers a right and a path to be able to correct or delete or withdraw. So it doesn't take it away from happening at all, but it's a foreseeable consequence. And why might that company choose voluntarily, but really as a risk mitigator, to offer a way to, if that is spotted, to undo that? And we've seen that kind of in non-advanced AI, but just the internet, right? If there's false information on content sites, we've seen paths to help correct that. So I think it's just being creative too, in anticipating in this new context, how does that apply?
Thanks, Elisa.
So sorry, go ahead.
No, we're getting a ton of questions, and actually like a lot of questions. So we're going to try and address these, but let's kind of use them as a guide. But I think we're hitting most of these. So thanks. Yeah.
So one thing I always think, again, just table stakes. Is the business thinking of using this internally, externally? Are we thinking of using this with personal information? Obviously, if personal information is involved, then we're thinking at least privacy. There's probably other things to consider, but you're using personal data. And so as privacy professionals, we know that raises some questions, and certainly with the shifting landscape, different kinds of risks and different kinds of obligations. Thinking about how sensitive the data is, whether it's personal information or just sensitive commercial information. We've seen some companies with very concerned about their IP decide, like, thou shalt not use generative AI at this point. It's just not approved in any way, shape, or form. And others being able to identify that's a risk, but feel comfortable managing around it. I think there is a difference between doing that and having a formal policy, kind of doing that, and then having a formal policy on the other end of the spectrum. And then probably something in between, because if you look, I mean, ChatGPT is the #1 downloaded app, I think, in productivity. And whether there's an enterprise version being used within the company, there's probably a good chance that many individuals within the company are using it, whether it's blessed or not. And so really thinking in the middle of that spectrum, are there at least guidelines? Are there at least some use cases that you've vetted and can roll out in some capacity because you anticipate it's being used in any event?
So we'll talk in a second about some of the technical solutions for that as well that are emerging. So one of my favorite quotes of yours is this idea of controls and contracts. Can you unpack that a little for us here, and as you think about Gen AI?
Sure. So first, a lot of companies are using a third-party provided tool, right? And some are creating, there's enterprise versions of those, and you are relying in many sense on a contract, right? Here is the enterprise contract on what they promised to do or not to do with that data. So that's great. But what we always know with contracts is like there's a trust and verify, and sometimes through the best of intentions, contract terms are violated. And so depending on the risk, right, how important are you relying on those contract terms, you may want to do something in addition. And so thinking through what are the controls, both in your early diligence phase in terms of what kind of data we're putting in, who's using it, how do we manage that intake versus the output, and what are the controls for all the foreseeable risks that we just talked about? What are some of those controls? And that, look, we'll take data security where we talked about administrative, physical, technical, right? It's going to be different depending on your use case, but both in contract terms and the plus factors, I think, are really important.
Lisa, just to hit some of these questions, like for us, the AI model or algorithm is another endpoint in which you're sending data, and you need to understand where that data is going, what's entered that model, and then we'll talk later about how we're looking at some of the outcomes of that data, specifically how we're checking for bias and how we're managing prompts and completions. And then commercially, how are you thinking about, what are some of the little considerations there?
Well, this is a very exciting type of technology. So we're seeing just so many companies want to incorporate and use that as a tool, as a vendor tool, as technology they provide in a B2B context. And so fabulous, that's exciting. The stakes are higher because you're now commercially offering it out. And so the types of foreseeable consequences, I think it's just a broader array, right? This is, even if you say you're only supposed to use it for A, B, and C, and it's not blessed for all these other reasons, you probably can anticipate that some are going to use it for those non-blessed reasons. And so how do you mitigate that? How do you, some of that is in training and guidance and awareness in policies. We've seen other examples pre-AI where you have those types of risk issues, and you got to be creative on how you try to solve for those without having it be a perfect solution. OpenAI, for example, their privacy policy, I think, is an interesting read. There's a paragraph particularly on this: you shall not rely on this for accurate information. And I think that that's important because we know that it can hallucinate, I love that word, but that you can have wrong information provided. And so if you are offering this out in a commercial use case, knowing that the information may not be accurate, how do you manage around that, both in your advertising of the product and then tools to help mitigate that once it's on the market? And then how do you continue to train it and improve it as you identify new risks that have to factor into the next versions, and making sure that your end customers are aware of that?
Now, Lisa, this has landed squarely on privacy practitioners' desks, right? Which is, I can see that, but I'm curious why you think that is. Obviously that's why we're doing this webinar here with the IAPP, but yeah, well, is this where it sits? Yeah.
So I think in some ways I'll be biased here, but I think privacy professionals have already done a lot of the legwork to know so many different stakeholders within the business, and they've built those relationships, and they have done risk assessments on use of data. Now, maybe the data was personal information, but I think you're almost treated as you're the go-to for things involving data, whatever kind of data. And I think there's both that's positive, and there's some risk with that, because it's not only a privacy risk mitigation obligation. And also many of those people right now are in over their heads with just trying to comply and address the new state privacy law obligations. So I think it's really, how do you pull in the right group of people? Privacy is one. There's a lot of just institutional knowledge that person likely has, but there are other stakeholders that I think are really important. And if anything, it's who's the business accountable leader, and then who are representatives within legal and compliance and third-party risk management to help make that team.
Gotcha. Thanks, Lisa. And Jakob, back to you. You've written a couple pieces on what privacy practitioners need to know in that vein, Elisa. What privacy practitioners need to know about AI. And so one of your first pieces here, which we're going to link to all these, by the way, these slides will be available to everybody. Jakob, in this piece in Ad Exchanger, you talked about these 4 things that every privacy practitioner needs to know. Can you unpack those a little for us? We've summarized them here on screen.
Sure. And I mean, just to address a little bit some of the Lisa's last comments about, why privacy practitioners are best positioned and why is it going like that. History has this magic that when you look back in hindsight, you can connect all the dots and it makes complete sense. But of course that wasn't the plan, but at least myself, being a practitioner of AI, being in the space of privacy and trust as well. I mean, it was obvious to me as a practitioner that we are gonna, while AI and machine learning, all the great work is rushing ahead, we're gonna hit a wall where the lack of trust, fundamental trust in the system means that we will not get the right data we need to keep growing and doing what we need to do. And it was existentialistic, like the use cases like IoT or smart cars or smart everything is not going to happen until we solve it. So the fact that privacy flared out the way it did around data made complete sense to me. And the fact that the next, data's main day job going forward is going to be to feed into intelligent systems. I mean, by far, if when we started this idea of privacy, it was a lot about that initial collection of data we did and it living in a database somewhere. Increasingly, where we're going to see data is a lot less about that individual interactions, but more about how it gets multiplied and feeds into many, many, many intelligent systems and lives inside models in many, many different places. So the size, just the same as we made a statement about synthetic data, the majority of the data is going to live inside models. And so naturally, that's the area where we need to go and progress from the original thoughts around privacy and the data singularity, datum pieces, to now data within the context of AI. The first thing I think to realize is, and that's again to Elisa's point, it's the purpose, right? Like AI in and of itself is not an end. It's a mean to an end. So you still need to decide what it is that you want to do with the data. You might be leveraging AI to do so, and increasingly that would be the case. But you need to be very clear when you engage in something, what is the purpose by which you want to operate? That I think folks understand that data is used to train a model. And I think that is understood. What is maybe less understood is that when you train the model, the output of training a model is now a trained model. And a trained model in and of itself contains these things we call parameters and hyperparameters, which are the bits that we tweaked to make the model know what it knows. But then those parameters in and of itself, they're data. There's plenty of work that shows that you can create an attack on those parameters alone and reverse back into the data itself. So you should treat those as data. That means that those trained models themselves now become an artifact, just the same as a table in the database needs to be protected and thought of. Now those artifacts need to be understood as data and be applied all the privacy and the regulations and governance of data we need. And if you use a third party to do something around AI, well, you need to know that just the same as you send data to a third party, there's obligations there. Those models also carry those obligations as well. So the fact that you use a service for machine learning and AI or a third party service to do so doesn't negate the need around governance. And that ultimately, like this idea of ethical data, and we'll talk about that in a moment, is a larger umbrella maybe than just privacy. It contains privacy, but it contains other ideas. And as we progress from data now into AI, see, data on itself could not do things. It was just, it had its own rights it carries, like the right for privacy and dignity and so on. But once this data is used into models, the models themselves can start having a lot of effect in the world, and discrimination and a lot of negative outcomes. So now it weaponized data, if you'd like, very much into a real meaningful impact in the world. So now ethics gets involved. We maybe didn't think about ethics when it was just data, but now as it comes with machine learning, now we got to think about the ethical use of it. And so I think privacy will naturally evolve into ethical use of data.
Yeah, Jakob, I'm with you on that. It seems to me to be like an accelerant or fuel to the fire. But looking at AI as a way to kind of understand now, do we have ethical issues in the data that we're using and how we're using it? And we need to look at that before we kind of throw AI onto it, or while we're throwing AI onto it, because it has the potential to just accelerate a lot of the biases that may be in there already. One of the ideas that's fascinating to me is, in ChatGPT as an example, it was kind of an unintended consequence or a happy accident, right? That we kind of found out that ChatGPT, even though it was trained on English language searches, there was some French in there, and we kind of found out by a happy accident that it's a great translator. Okay, so how do we preserve these happy accidents? And one of the lenses to think about that is, how do you kind of find this balance between regulation and innovation? And I wanted to ask both of you those. The 4 bullets we have here, Jakob, from your next piece on kind of your thoughts there, but I'd love to ask Elisa as well. Elisa, do you want to go first on that one? Like, how do you regulate a technology that's as early as AI and at the same time kind of encourage innovation?
Well, I mean, it underscores one of the questions in the chat, but that we've talked about largely in having access to data and big companies versus small companies and the value of open source. And so I think there are some concerns that if it's heavily regulated, like you cannot use it or offer it unless you're first licensed, for example, then in some ways, like, fear is really, I think, taking over, because the happy accidents are some of the anomalous things. And how do you even forecast that there's going to be those anomalous occurrences without having more ability to use it, and use it in ways, for example, that actually don't pose a whole lot of risk? There's a lot of use cases that are just a very positive use case that you absolutely can manage the risk. So I think it comes back to really being transparent about the fears. I think we're all pretty realistic that some jobs are going to be lost. There's a lot of first drafts that this tool can do that for a lot of entry-level roles, and white-collar jobs are probably going to be impacted. And I think from a policy side, it's really thinking about all those harms, not just the legal harms, right? The economic harms in terms of jobs, and playing it out, original content. A lot of the original content gets created because people are paying for that original content, or they're paying for advertising related to that original content. And if that goes away, or there's less demand, that has another economic effect on jobs and just culture and art. So I think there's a lot of need for innovation, and we should not be afraid of it. There's a lot more policy side here than I think as to really strict regulation, and the existential are real ones, but not for, they're bad actors, obviously, but I think a lot of the existential concerns are still not about today's version. It's about the fear on what are future versions that really go beyond what we know today.
Jakob, I imagine you're a technologist who wants to run fast on AI. So how do you think about regulation that's there or forming in this space?
Yeah, if we take a step back for a moment and try to learn from other examples in the past where it happens. Clearly, as humanity, we have an interest in both creating and finding and discovering new technologies and new science, etc., that always led overall to the growth of prosperity of humanity. But we want to mitigate as much as possible any negative effects, and we've done it to a lesser or greater success, I think, historically. I know Oppenheimer and the atom bomb is being mentioned a lot now in the context of AI, and how do we not repeat, quote unquote, the mistake there, a great E equals MC squared. Fantastic. We've realized something fundamental about the nature of the universe. And next thing, where, you know, we're still living in a planet where we have the power to annihilate it as a result. I mean, that's you know, I mean, that's scary. But you know, so how do we not repeat the mistake here in AI? I think that I'm confident that we're going to get it right eventually, and I'm also quite certain we're going to get it wrong a little bit on the way there. I mean, that's to judge historically. I think that the focus should be, I mean, and Elisa mentioned that before. First of all, we already have a very well-established principles and laws and regulations around behaviors and actions and you know, in the market and the industry, and we need to uphold them here as well. It's not so much the AI, it's the outcome of what you're doing. If there is discrimination, if there is unfair, if there is malicious, if there is any other thing that comes out of it, well, we have the tools to go and prosecute that and chase it and find out what's going on there. I'd like, and I believe that in the problem lies the solution as well. In some sense, there will be technology built to address some of those. So definitely, and JJ, you've got Catch there in the background, right? So we are building real technology that is meant to address a lot of these issues. And so we'll use technology to fix the technology problems. And the same thing will go with AI, right? So you talk about AI needing a lot of data and to train, and we talked about synthetic data. Well, the generative AI will be really good in generating data as well. So we could use kind of the same technology to produce stuff. And I think we're also going to stratify the world. So I mean, it's going to be we're you know, we will regulate heavily the big players because they should be regulated because they have the most potential to create damage, but they also have kind of benefited from it. And we'll regulate less the smaller players or the industries that are less in danger. And if you look at the EU AI Act and the NIST framework for artificial intelligence and the bills that are coming out, they all do about the same, right? They'll create spaces where innovation can flourish, and then we'll regulate where we're more likely to have impact. So I think it'll be in the right direction. We'll probably have a slide about it in a moment. We'll probably get it right a couple of times before we get it wrong.
Yeah, thanks both. And so speaking of technology, and so one of the things that we were obsessed with at Catch, as we kind of extend into the AI space, and first of all, do you even still call it privacy tech? But Elisa, maybe it's kind of like the parallel is, well, privacy professionals are working on AI. Why can't privacy tech also work on AI? So we're totally in that same space, but there's the bread and water, right, around this stuff, which is the AI and algorithmic automated decision-making, risk assessments, as you kind of mentioned. There's extensions of your data discovery and classification that now see AI and its algorithms as an endpoint, so we can identify when personal information is inside those models. To answer one of the questions in the chat, we can also remove or anonymize PII where it exists in prompts and completions. And so prompts and completions are the variables in kind of this new world we're entering, right, Yaakov, which some folks are calling prompt engineering, which is the art to asking the perfect question. So we'll talk about that a little. So for us, it's yes on the risk assessments, yes on extending data discovery and classification, yes on extending data subject rights fulfillment into prompt engineering and AI interfaces. But then some of the really exciting stuff we have we're building as well is one we're calling Turtleback, which is this idea that you have a system of record for all your prompts, all the questions that you've asked OpenAI and ChatGPT and all these AI applications, this ability to manage those prompts, have a database of those prompts, and fine-tune the unstructured data that you're using to work through places like OpenAI. And then secondly, what we're calling Moonraker, this idea of detecting bias very early in the process. So for example, as you can see the data inputs that you have, is there potential for bias there? We're using synthetic data to kind of help complete that picture. And then on the outcome side, was there bias and how do you kind of go back and correct that? So there's a ton of exciting stuff. You can talk to us at Catch later about it if you like. We'll include some of this in the resources section. But let's, in the few minutes we have here, let's take some questions, but also let's talk about the path forward. One of the ways I want to do that, Yaakov and Elisa, is there's a ton of AI regulatory frameworks out there, but one of them, just to pick one, was Chuck Schumer's. And what I liked about it is, I think regulators and legislators sometimes, get criticized and are not knowing technology enough. But actually what I've seen from the FTC, especially when it comes to pixel tracking, is they kind of do get it. And I loved Bedoya's speech at the IAPP. I think I like Chuck Schumer's AI framework, right? He talks about the who, where, and how, and the protect. And the 4 pillars there, what I wanted to ask you, Yakov, is how crazy are these from the perspective of a technologist looking at how a legislator is thinking about this? And I wanted to focus on 1 and 3. So for example, the first piece, the who trained the algorithm and who the intended audience is. How easy or difficult is that to do? And what are the things we need to think about?
Yeah, so, and we had this conversation before I think these are all headed in the right direction, but they suffer from what I call the first order approximation kind of problem, right? So I mean, when I read number 1, I think what it's trying to allude to is this idea of accountability, right? That we need to have a way to have accountability, because we know that when we remove accountability, then a lot of bad things can happen. So how do we have some accountability in the systems, around the algorithms, around the outcomes, around the and so on? My criticism would be that as I explained before, these systems, this model, I mean, even if it's OpenAI, the assembly of those, it's a multiplicity of models and people and techniques, and I'd like to believe that part of the power we're going to see is the ability to build one on top of the other. So for example, a lot of the open source large language models, LLMs that exist today, they're already packaged in that way, and now innovation creates on top of it. And so now you have these incremental Lego blocks of innovation that happens. There's not, there isn't one person that is kind of responsible for everything. So we will need to come up with some frameworks to understand what exactly accountability means and how do we trace it back. Again, I don't think it's the first time. We have it in other places. I know we do it in chemistry, we do it in pharmaceutical kind of, there's other areas where things are compounded and there's many different pieces, and we still figure out how to do accountability. So as it is, I think it's a bit naive, but I think what it alludes to as far as accountability makes sense. The number 3 is, it's almost I think there's a big fear out there that, oh my God, these things are black boxes. We have no idea. We just threw it out there and it just works. That's not the case, right? There's a lot of people, a lot of smart folks in a lot of universities for many, many, many years have been working at it. And we do have a good understanding of how they work, and we do understand how to unpack it. If something goes wrong, we know how to move back and figure out what went wrong and why it went wrong and how to fix it. What we don't have yet, and that's fine, is a grand theory, mathematical theory of all these neural nets, and that explains it all in a grand theory as we like it, for example, as we do sometimes in physics. But that's okay. Science sometimes progress that way. Sometimes theory is ahead of experimentation. Sometimes experimentation is ahead of science, theory, sorry. And so this is where we're at right now. I think we'll get some progress there eventually. But when I read number 3, what I really see here is some idea of agency, right? This idea that we have a right to know at some level how we've been judged by these systems, because we want to have agency over how our data and how our information, how it's being used. And I think that is an important principle that we'll still keep on. So again, high-level principles, I think where it's headed to, it's correct. How it's written, maybe we'll have to, iterate on. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, thanks, Yakov. So I know you're involved with a think tank called the Ethical Tech Project, which is a meeting of the minds, people in business, policy and legal, education, technology. And the idea is that we're kind of setting the world up for an ethical internet. And so there's 2 big pieces to that. As you know, there's it's funny, like Elisa, when you say non-lawyers, totally a non-lawyer, Yakov does a non-technical thing. He's a non-technical blueprint, he's a technical blueprint. So we'll talk about these 2, but can you give us a little overview of kind of what you're doing here at the Ethical Tech Project, Yakov, and these 2 blueprints, the non-technical and the technical? What are they?
Yeah, so we put together the ethical project a couple of years back. It was started again from a lot of privacy kind of thinking, and then evolved into this idea of ethical use of data. We've sensed that there is a gap in market, particularly with technologists, where there's a lot of conversations about the policy and the regulations and the legal aspects of things. But as a technologist myself, like there's somebody who builds systems to collect, store, process, analyze, and share data, it wasn't immediately clear beyond the human aspect of it. How do I design my systems different today to be able to both help my organization stay compliant today, but also be some level of robustness and future-proof on what is coming down the pike with respect to all of those regulations. And that it seemed very disruptive to how we do everything we do with data as far as the technology. So how do we start there? So we really started with the technical blueprint. We wanted to come up with a reference architecture. We went around the entire industry. We spoke to organizations like NIST and BBB, some of the standards out there. We spoke to legal. Elisa is also on the board here in the ETP and helps connect us with a lot of folks in the industry. And we've put together a privacy architecture. This is an open source project that you can find on GitHub today. And as we were doing that, we also realized that when we went back to the technologists, we said, okay, great, we have a reference architecture. How about now? And they said, oh, well, that's great, but the organization hasn't prioritized that yet. So we'd love to implement it, but that's going to be 2025. So we understood that we need to bring the entire organization on the journey, and that's where we came up with this non-technical blueprint. So now we think that the key going forward is having these two. And the 5 principles they map is these same ones that we've already seen there across the thing. It's privacy, it is agency about how to empower consumers to have power about the future and the destination, the destiny of the data. Transparency across the board that ties in with actually accountability, and fairness is this ideal that we do want the outcome of all of that to be in line with our ideas and ethics around how data need to be used. So that's the high level. If you want to know more, of course, contact me when we can. We're looking for folks to help us both on the technical and the non-technical side. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, and so there'll be some folks asking about how to sign up. So we'll send this deck around. Lisa, I wanted to ask you something in this context. This idea of a privacy promise or these principles, right? Like one of the reactions we saw a couple of weeks ago at a conference we were at was, well, if the FTC is going after deceptive conduct, why make promises? Like what? Like should we just stop making promises? And I know there's a lot of reasons why that's probably the wrong way to think about it, but how do you think about that as a lawyer? Would you encourage people just don't make promises since the FTC is going after it, or just actually make the promises but just make sure you can fulfill those?
So, I mean, I think to play it back, there are some discussions around concern that if I say the wrong thing, if I say something that's not perfect, I'm going to be legally liable for that. And so do I mitigate that risk by just saying fluffy, very soft legally crafted statements that are not, you can't have a regulator to get a hook in. And I think that doesn't work for business. I mean, it certainly doesn't work to communicate and build customer trust or employee trust. I think you'll find a lot of companies feel compelled to take a stand and communicate things. But I also think the trend line on transparency it's happened. You can't deny that it's happened. And as we think about go forward frameworks with AI, I mean, that really depends a lot on transparency, which means I think the ultimate obligation is you need to know what is happening so you can communicate it accurately. And it used to be privacy policies, obviously written by lawyers. Business did not really care what was in the privacy policy. It was not a beautiful work of art. There was not a whole lot of investment in it. And I think that transparency now, and back to the stakeholders and making sure you have accurate information and you can convey it in an effective way, is putting pressure on privacy statements, or really data use statements, to be a lot more user friendly. So at the end of the day, I think it's trust. And I think you got to know what you're saying and say it accurately.
Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate that. It's a nice closing comment. There's some resources here if you want to get involved with the Ethical Tech Project, if you want to talk to Ketch about AI and privacy. Kelly Dry puts out a great advertising and privacy law update at Law Access. And we've included some references that you might find useful. Yakov's piece on AI consideration for privacy professionals, Microsoft's proposal on AI, and the American Bar Association's paper on AI and machine learning. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. There was just so many. We probably need another hour just to do that. But Yakov and Elisa, I just wanted to say thank you for your time and perspective here today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Marjorie, did you have any closing comments?
Yes, sorry, my mouse disconnected from my computer. But thank you so much to the panel for that great discussion. We also want to give a big thank you to Ketch for sponsoring today's program so that it's free to our audience. Lastly, I do want to encourage our attendees to click the survey link that was put in the chat about 10 minutes ago and briefly give us your feedback on today's program. It really helps us to improve our web conference programming, so we certainly appreciate it. That wraps up the program here today. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at another IAPP web conference soon.
Thanks, everybody.